Swords and Swordsmen. It's a book about the history of the sword, and it goes from the Bronze Age all the way through to the American Civil War. And in fact, in the middle, we go off to Japan and have a look at Japanese swords. But it's also about swordsmen, about the people who wore swords, about the people whose hands gripped their hilts in anger and fought with them on the battlefield, fought with them in private duel. It's about the people who made swords, who put hammer to anvil to beat out these fantastically beautiful weapons. And what I wanted to do was write a book that shared that passion, shared that interest with as wide a readership as possible. I wanted it to be accessible to the general history reader just as much as to the sword specialist. Now, in order to do that, what I did was I selected swords that would tell stories. Swords that were owned by famous people and are still in collections today. So, for instance, we start with the sword of Tutankhamun, which is in the Cairo Museum. Of course, I tell you about bronze swords in general and other types of bronze swords, but I tell you about his sword, his khapesh, and how they were used, how they were made, and I tell you about Tutankhamun, about his life, and about Egyptian warfare at the time. And so with the chapter on Henry V and Henry V's sword, in fact, that's the sword on the cover, we have the most iconic type of medieval sword at the high point of the Middle Ages, owned by a most iconic medieval warrior. And Henry V has a fascinating private story. His life is full of interest, as well as the interest given by the battles that he fought, Shrewsbury and Agincourt. With the sword of Uesugi Kenshin, I go to Japan and we look at the whole samurai culture and the culture of Japanese swords and how they're made and what they mean. It was Tokugawa Ieyasu who said that the soul of the samurai lives in his sword. And with the sword of George Washington, I not only look at the life of the man, but I give an overview of the Revolutionary War. I've identified 10 swords, in fact, that were owned by Washington, and this is probably the most comprehensive survey of them written to date. These swords act as prisms to look into the world in which they existed. So through the sword we see the man, and through the man we see his life and his times. And we put the swords in context. This book also is looking not only at swords in war, at swords for ceremonial and ritual use, at swords as magic totems, but it's also looking at the history of the duel, from its earliest beginnings to when it finally faded out in the 19th century. What fascinates me about this subject, the thing that has drawn me over all these years to this subject more than anything else, is that swords are like keys that unlock many doors. By having an interest in this subject, I've had to learn about science, about metallurgy, about how the swords are made, and I've had to learn about art history and fashion, and how swords have been decorated and ornamented, and how that fits in with the cultural feel of the times. There's the stories of military history, the tales of great battles, and the extraordinary stories of private duels, some of them so ridiculous that you'd hardly believe them. But they're all in here. Tales of people and an appreciation of the weapon. And amongst that is my own experiential life with swords. I have spent most of my adult life with a sword in hand. I taught in London drama schools for a quarter of a century, 5 days a week. It was my laboratory. That's where I learned about the feel of swords. It's where I put into practice and tried out the theories that I'd found by going to museums and looking at the old fight manuals. And I've tried to incorporate all this into one volume. Tales of my life, tales of great heroes and leaders, tales of the craftsmen, tales of the fight masters, and at the heart, these wonderful magical weapons. And because I've chosen swords that were owned by famous people, these are probably the best swords surviving that were ever made. They are really, really beautiful art objects. And the book is full of colour plates and wonderful drawings. Colour plates of the people, colour plates of the swords, and drawings by my good friend Adam Deforge that bring the fights alive. So we can see a scene going on, and it really takes us into that world. And that's what I hope this book will do to you. I hope it will take you into lots of different worlds. Worlds that I now feel I've travelled in, and I'd like you to be my travelling companion. You can read more about the book on my website, www.mikeloads.com.